ध्यानमूलं गुरोर्मूर्तिः पूजामूलं गुरोपदं मन्त्रमूलं गुरोर्वाक्यं मोक्षमूलं गुरोः कृपा. My dear brothers and sisters, today is a special day. It was on this date, the 5th of December, that in the year 1950, Sri Aurobindo left his body. On this special day, it's my privilege to pass on to all of you the love and blessings of Sri Aurobindo and the Mother from Sri Aurobindo Ashram, Delhi branch. The title of this session is Nitya Tripto Nirashraya. This expression, Nitya Tripto, the one who is ever contented, rather ever fulfilled, never wanting anything. Nirashraya, never dependent on anything outside himself or herself, never dependent on anything or any person, any relationship, any circumstances outside for his happiness. This expression, Nitya Tripto Nirashraya, occurs in the Gita. In the 4th chapter, it is the 20th shloka, and let me read that out. Tyaktva karma phala sangam nitya tripto nirashraya karmanya abhipravrittopi naiva kinchit karoti sa. Tyaktva karma phala sangam. The one who has given up, renounced the fruit of his actions, the karma phala. He has given that up, renounced it. Nitya Tripto Nirashraya, and is always contented, rather fulfilled, and is never dependent on anything. It's understood for his well-being. Karmanya abhipravrittopi. In spite of being engaged in work, naiva kinchit karoti sa, doesn't do anything. Now, this type of a state, when the person is engaged in work, which means that this doesn't apply to, at least not necessarily to someone who's renounced the world and renounced worldly life, and is in a state of apparent total inactivity. This is a person who is engaged in work and yet as if he is doing nothing. Why is he doing nothing? Because of the attitude with which he is working, and that is what makes him Nitya Tripta and Nirashraya. Always contented, never dependent. Now, this is a state of mind that is the terminal point, the goal in the journey of yoga. And this particular shloka comes in the context of Karma Yoga. What are the characteristics of a divine worker, and what is the state of mind that he reaches when he is at the end of this journey of yoga through Karma Yoga? Now, if one were to think of somebody Nitya Tripta and Nirashraya, it would be difficult to find an example better than that of Sri Aurobindo. When Sri Aurobindo had just gone to Pondicherry in the year 1910, and he was living with a few young men who were with him in the freedom struggle and had either accompanied him to Pondicherry or had followed soon after, the routine was that in the evening all these young men went for games. Sri Aurobindo didn't. But then they cooked the evening meal before leaving, And Sri Aurobindo would have his meal while these people were away for sports, and then retire to his room for his quiet sadhana, whereas these young men would return later and have their meal. One day it so happened that when they came back after their games and had the meal, they realized that they had forgotten to add salt to the vegetable, and that was the only vegetable they had made, just one vegetable, and it had no salt. So the next day they asked Sri Aurobindo, "How did you find the food yesterday?" He said, "It was okay. But yesterday we had forgotten to add salt." And the answer that Sri Aurobindo gave was, just as salt has a taste, saltlessness also has a taste. So if you can find taste in saltlessness and are equally happy with either taste, that reflects this Nitya Tripta Nirashraya state. Now, how does one move towards that type of a state? Firstly, by working not with the feeling that I am doing the work, but with the feeling that I am only an instrument of the divine for doing this work. And to understand this, there's a little story. Once there was a king. He was a very good king, took good care of his subjects, and he tried to take all those decisions which would make the lives of his subjects more and more comfortable and happy. When he was getting old, he was getting tired and felt that it would be nice if he could retire from this life, this very busy and hectic schedule, and devote a little more time to inner work. But then he couldn't find a second line. Who could take over and take care of his subjects as well he was doing? So he divulged this state of mind to his guru, and his guru told him, "Oh, if that is the only problem, then you can feel relieved. I'll take care of your kingdom." So he says, naturally, what can be better than that? So then the guru asked him, "But then what will you do for a living?" So this king said, "I'll take a little money from the treasury and that will be enough for me. I don't have much needs." The guru said, "But you can't do that because you are no longer the king. I will not let you take any money from the treasury." So then the king said, "Then I'll find a job." So the guru said, "If I offer you a job, will you take that?" So he said, "What can be better than that?" So then the guru told him, "The job of the king is lying vacant in my kingdom. Would you like to take it?" Now, what this story illustrates is that the job remains the same, the work remains the same on the outside, but now he'll be doing it with a different attitude. Not as someone whose responsibility it is to take care of the kingdom, but as one who is doing it as an instrument of the Guru. And that relieves him of the anxiety that he was having. So in fact, it's in our own interest to work as an instrument, and if one just thinks a little, it's not difficult to cultivate that state of mind. After all, whatever work we are able to do because of the unique talents and gifts that we received, because of the circumstances that we got in our family, in our school, in the society in which we live. And then we are able to do that work because we got an opportunity to do the work. And if the work comes to a certain conclusion, it is again not because of our own efforts, at least not entirely because of our own efforts, but there are many, many intangible forces at work which make it possible, which one can easily see in so many things that we have done in our lives. Which means that there is an unseen hand of the divine working behind the scenes, and that is how we are able to do some work and take it to a certain conclusion. So therefore it's not difficult to understand this idea of being an instrument of the divine, and if we keep reminding ourselves of that, then we not only are able to do the work without that anxiety, but we are also it also becomes possible to be less and less attached to the outcome of the work, because the outcome is in the hands of the one whose instrument we are. And at the same time, we don't do the work in a perfunctory manner. We put all our heart and soul into it, because we are doing it as an instrument of the one whom we adore and worship. And therefore, it's our privilege to be the instruments of that higher force, and therefore we put our heart and soul into it. So the work is done with perfection. At least it's done as well as we can. And at the same time, we are not attached to the outcome, and there's no anxiety related to the work. And because we are working as an instrument, we are not doing the work, we expect no appreciation or reward either for the work. Now, this attitude of working as an instrument of the divine is both a preparation for reaching that state of mind, and it is also, that state means that higher state of mind in which one can be Nitya Tripta and Nirashraya. It is a preparation for that state, and it is also an expression of that state. Now, this is what Sri Aurobindo says in the Essays on the Gita. And that's when you realize how fine and refined Sri Aurobindo's thought process was, apart from his spiritual stature. That this is both a means and an expression. It is a means because it is by cultivating this type of attitude that we are an instrument of the divine, and trying to remind ourselves repeatedly of it, that we move towards that higher state of consciousness, which makes us feel more and more one with the divine. And when we have reached that stage, then it becomes an expression of that state of consciousness. It is because we are in that state of consciousness that we are able to do it. So in the beginning, we are trying to mold our mind to think that I am only an instrument of the divine. When we have reached that state, then we no longer have to mold the mind, because the mind is in that state. It can't think otherwise. That's the only way it can think. It can't think that I am doing it. It can only think that I am an instrument. So if that is the only way it can think, the mind has already been molded, and therefore it becomes habitual. That's what my nature becomes. That's what my swabhava becomes. So the only way I can think of is that I am the instrument of the divine. So now it becomes, to work like this, becomes an expression of that consciousness. Now, let's go a little further. When I realize that I am not the doer, I am only an instrument of the divine, the I is disappearing from this awareness of doing the work. And what is I? I is an expression of the ego, which means that the ego is going on diminishing. It helps me transcend my ego. And when the ego starts diminishing, the desires start diminishing. Because if we look at our desires, most of our desires are not our needs. They are an expression of the ego. I want good clothes so that I can make a good impression on others. I want a good house so that I can be more comfortable. I want good furniture in the house so that those who come to my house feel that I'm a great man. I should drive not only a car but a big car so that again people get impressed. Now, all these things are an expression of the ego. These are not my needs. And therefore, when the ego starts diminishing, the desires start diminishing. So, the desires start, starvation. And they start starving in the absence of the ego. In the absence of the support from the ego, the desires start getting starved. They start disappearing. The desires get reduced to a bare minimum. So if the desires are reduced to a bare minimum, if I don't want much, I'm reaching that state where I'll be always contented, Nitya Tripta. Another thing that happens as a result of this diminution of the ego is that I no longer remain dependent for my happiness on anything outside. Now, how does that happen? That happens, because there are two types of happiness. One is the happiness that I get when I get something. I have a desire, the desire is fulfilled, and then I'm happy. I want good food, I get that food, I'm happy. I want a a new dress, I get that dress and I am happy. Another type of happiness comes from giving. I am happy when I get a new dress. I am also happy when I give a dress to somebody in charity, somebody who needs it more than I do. I already have enough clothes to last me the rest of my life. But here is someone who needs a dress. When I give that dress to that person, again I feel happy. Now, what is it that makes me opt for this happiness that comes from giving rather than the happiness from getting? It is the diminution of the ego. Because the giving part, the giving something, is an expression of love. It's not an expression of ego. I'm feeling one with that person, which means I have dissolved the barrier, the ego barrier that separates me from the other person. Therefore, I can see the other person also as an extension of me. And therefore, if this person needs a dress, I feel as if I need the dress. There's no barrier between the two. And therefore, I'm able to express this love by giving this to this person, which I'm easily capable of giving and this person needs. So, that is the breakdown of the ego barrier through love. So, love and ego are opposites. And both have been planted in us. And one can look at them as two dogs. He said that if you have two dogs to take care of, who will survive and thrive? Not the more ferocious one. Ego is a ferocious dog, whereas love is a rather quiet and meek and mild dog. But then it is not the ferocious one that will survive. It is the one that is fed that will survive. Now, as a result of the ego going down, the ego is as if starving. So, if ego is starving, love starts thriving. And that's how love grows. And what does it do to my happiness? It undergoes a change. When I was acting through my ego, I say that I want this, I get it, and then I feel I'm happy. Now, when the ego has gone down, I say that I love, I give, and therefore I am happy. Now, the end state is happiness in both cases, but the happiness is of two different types. And the joy of giving feels much better than the happiness of getting. That's why we don't even call it happiness, we call it joy. We use better words than just happiness. And further, one more thing that happens is that I become free. I'm no longer dependent for my happiness on what I get. And that's very important because nobody can get everything that the person wants, but anybody can give if the person wants to. So giving is entirely in my control, getting is not. So if my happiness, or rather joy, now depends upon something for which I am not dependent on anybody else or any other outer circumstance, then I become nirashraya. So that is how I become nirashraya. So because now my happiness or sense of well-being is no longer dependent upon what I get from outside, what my outer circumstances are. So this diminution of the ego leads to both reduction in desires and therefore one becomes nitya tripta, and it also leads to the state of being nirashraya, because now my joy comes from giving, for which I am not dependent upon anybody, which is always in my own hands. Now let's see this in the context of a modern psychologist, modern in the sense that he was a 20th century psychologist, Skinner. What Skinner did was to study rats. He designed a box and placed the rat in the box, and inside the box was a lever which extended outside the box in such a way that if you press the lever inside the box, the lever outside, which had a spoon-like extension, would pick up a pellet of food and the pellet would then drop in the cage. So if you place a rat in such a cage, initially it just plays around and then accidentally it hits the lever and then there's a thud. And then he finds the thud came from this pellet of food that has just fallen. He puts this pellet in his mouth and enjoys it and feels, wow, I got food. He continues to play and then again hits the lever, again another pellet. So now gradually the rat builds up an association that every time I press the lever, I get food. So then it starts getting greedy. And the tuck, 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 tuck. He goes on pressing the lever again and again to get more and more pellets. Now, then this psychologist devised another arrangement. The rat would not get the pellet every time, but every alternate time. Once it will get it, once it will not. And the rat realized that also. Doesn't matter, I have to press twice, but I get the pellet once. Then, only once out of 3 times, once out of 4 times, and so on. The rat was intelligent enough to understand, and he would press repeatedly to get one more pellet. Then, he introduced another variation. Here at least there was a regularity. Once out of every 2 presses, 3 presses, or 4 times pressing, he gets a pellet. Now he became this reinforcement, this reward or reinforcement for action, to act, to press the lever, started coming in an erratic, unpredictable manner. This is what he called an irregular schedule of reinforcement, which means that he can go on pressing at random. Once in a while a pellet will drop. Now, this was a little more frustrating for the rat, and if the pellet came after pressing too many times, the rat started getting neurotic and crazy. But then through these experiments, what Skinner derived was that we work towards a reward. The word reward works as a reinforcement. It's a motive for our work. And to some extent it applies to us also. Now in the present context, how does it fit in? If I ask you, what is the type of schedule of reinforcement that we have in life? Which means if we do something, we expect a reward, at least not any other reward, at least being successful at the work. If we expect that. Now what is the type of schedule that we have in life? It's an irregular, unpredictable schedule. Which means some of our efforts are rewarded with success, some are not. And there's no predictability about after how many efforts which one will succeed. Now look at it in the context of the person who's on the journey of yoga. He's working as an instrument of the divine. He's not attached to the fruit. And therefore, irrespective of the fruit, he's equally happy. So what has this person been able to do? So-called success and so-called failure both give him that same degree of satisfaction, the same degree of happiness. That is what equality or samatva is about. Accepting everything with equal delight. So what has this person been able to do, which a rat perhaps cannot? This person has been able to convert this erratic, unpredictable, irregular schedule of reinforcement or reward into a regular, predictable schedule. Every time I press the lever, I get something. Which means every effort that I put in gives me joy because I could have the privilege of being an instrument of the divine. Now that is what the beauty of the journey of yoga is. That when you reach that state of Nitya Tripta Nirashraya, then this type of fluctuation in happiness, I put in an effort. Say, pressing the lever is an effort. I get rewarded, I am happy. I am not rewarded, I am unhappy. That disappears. Because every time I put in an effort, I am happy because of the mere privilege of being an instrument of the divine, and the outcome is in any case in the hands of the one whose instrument I am, and therefore my happiness does not depend upon the outcome. I am not dependent on the outcome for my happiness. So that is how it reaches there. Now, Sri Aurobindo, when he was in Pondicherry, by then, of course, he was being looked upon as a yogi. But it's not that only then he reached this state of being Nitya Tripta Nirashraya. When he was in London, his father was rather erratic in sending him money. And therefore, very often he and his brothers had to live on very little food. And even then he was not affected. When he came to Baroda, he started getting a princely salary of about 500 rupees a month while working as a professor teaching English and French in the college run by the Maharaja of Baroda. What he would do is, those days, the money was given in coins. So he would place the amount that he was given in a tray and leave it open on a table, so that anybody who needed the money could pick up something. And this he did because his needs were very little, and he didn't want to take care of the money and go through all that. The looking after money can be also a bit of a problem for someone who is just not interested in it. So he was not dependent upon this money and getting what money could buy for his well-being. So he just left it there so that those who need it can have it. So once, one of the persons, Dinendra Kumar Roy, who was living with him those days, asked him that, why do you do that? At least you should keep some account. He says, God keeps the account for me. So he was Nitya Tripta Nirashraya in London, and so was in Baroda. And then when he was in jail for 1 year, from 1908 to 1909, he had rather dirty blankets wrapped around him. The food was horrible, but again that didn't disturb him. He saw in the blankets which were around him Lord Krishna's arms, as if he was in the Lord's arms, the Lord embracing him and hugging him with those blankets. So he was a Nitya Tripta Nirashraya all along. Now how does that happen? That even as a young person, in London he was, when he was living on very little food and still not affected, he was in his teens. How does a teenager become independent of anything outside, even food, as something as essential as food for his sense of well-being? An explanation comes in the Gita. It is one of the explanations. Why I am saying one of the explanations is because another explanation which would be more applicable to Sri Aurobindo is that he was an avatar. He was always in that state. He had just put on a human form, and therefore some of these limitations of the ordinary human beings didn't apply to him. He was an avatar. But then there is one more explanation which applies to ordinary mortals like me, and that comes in the 6th chapter of the Gita. How even a person at a young age can be quite contented. Now in the 6th chapter of the Gita, Arjun asks Sri Krishna that how about the asafal yogi, the unsuccessful yogi, who is on the path of yoga but is not fully successful in his life? Is it that he misses the usual pleasures of life and also the perfection that yoga strives for? So neither here nor there, misses both. So Sri Krishna replies, no, that doesn't happen. Whatever progress you make in one life gives you a head start. In the next life, you can start from where you left off. And that comes very clearly in the 43rd shloka of the 6th chapter of the Gita, which reads, Tatra tam buddhi sanyogam labhate paurva dehikam yatate cha tato bhuya samsiddhau kurunandana. Tatra tam buddhi sanyogam labhate paurva dehikam. Tatra, that is there means there in this particular life which we are talking about. Tam buddhi samyogam labhate paurva dehikam. Paurva dehikam, previous bodies. So whatever bodies the person had assumed previously in his previous lives, as a result of that, whatever he had gained, labhate paurva dehikam, whatever new level of consciousness he has reached, whatever he has gained in the previous lives, that gives him a certain type of buddhi. Buddhi sanyogam labhate paurva dehikam. So it gives him a certain type of mentality. So he has a certain type of mentality, a mental disposition, which is the result of the type of progress that he had made in previous lives. And therefore what happens? And then it comes in the next line, Yatate cha tato bhuya samsiddhau kurunandana. Kurunandana is another name for Arjun. So as a result of that, what happens is, Yatate cha tato bhuya samsiddhau. So it is from there that he begins once again to strive for perfection, for the siddhi. So it is from that state of mentality. So that is why, it's not surprising that sometimes we find that a 5-year-old seems more contented than a 50-year-old. But this 5 and 50 is only for this particular life in this world. But the person who's 5-year-old probably has much more experience through previous lives in which he has put in all that homework which was required to reach that state of mind even at the age of 5. So that is how this type of things that we find in real life happen. And therefore, a person can be contented even in early life. And that reminds me of a young girl. I can call her a girl. She was less than half my age, who was here in the ashram a few days back. She's a psychologist and teaches psychology at the Auro University in Surat. Her name is Aditi Kaul. She made a very profound statement. She said, youngsters these days, what they call freedom is actually slavery to the senses. And that at once struck me. And of course, she elaborated upon it a bit too. She had thought through it, and that's how she had reached that conclusion. Very often we hear expressions from young people like, I want to be free, and I have that freedom. I have a right to that freedom. Freedom to do what? I can eat what I like, I can dress as I like, I can say what I like, I can do what I like. Now, when a person says that, let us see what type of freedom actually the person is asking. It is really freedom. Suppose, say I want this particular food, and I have the freedom to get it. Now, when the person says, I want that food, already the person is dependent on that food for his happiness. So, being dependent is not what being free is about. But the person is actually dependent on that food for his happiness, but then the intellect can be very versatile and tricky, and it's interpreted as that because I have the right to get the type of food I want, that is a type of freedom. And therefore the person doesn't say that I'm dependent on this food for my freedom and therefore I'm not free. The person says, I want the freedom to eat what I like. So the person looks upon it as a freedom, whereas actually it is slavery. Slavery to what? Slavery to the palate. Slavery to a sensory pleasure. Slavery to the taste for food, which is a sensory pleasure. So the slavery to this, which has made this person dependent on this food, makes him say that I want to be free to eat what I like. I want the freedom to eat what I like. So that is so the person is dependent. So what is the person dependent upon? A sensory pleasure. So the person is actually a slave to the sensory pleasure. So it is slavery that sometimes we interpret as freedom. Slavery to the senses. So that's what she was saying. On the other hand, what is Nitya Tripta Nirashraya? That is genuine freedom. Because the person is not dependent upon anything, because the person doesn't want anything. And because the person doesn't want anything, the person is not dependent on anything for his happiness. Not wanting anything and therefore not being dependent is true freedom. That is moksha in this life, in this very world. So one doesn't have to die to get that moksha. And that is basic to Sri Aurobindo in the Mother's philosophy, that you can bring that heaven down here on earth, and reaching that state of beatitude, that state of bliss, is not to be we don't have to resign ourselves to the fact that will come sometime later, in some time after death, in some other world. It can come right here. It's just the attitude that we take, and in this particular chapter of the Gita, the emphasis on the attitude that we take to our work. So, what is true freedom? Now, we can look at it this way. Freedom from what and freedom to do what? Freedom from what? Freedom from the bondage that brings us misery. Bondages of what type? Bondage of sensory pleasures, bondages of various types of desires coming from the vital and the mental, that is the desire for wealth, position, power, prestige. Now, these are bondages. attachment to relationships and possessions, these are bondages. So freedom from all these bondages. So freedom from. Freedom to do what? Freedom to reject. Freedom to reject everything that comes in the way of moving in this direction. Rejection is one of the important pillars of the sadhana. Rejecting our desires, anger, greed, jealousy, hatred, all these negativities, rejecting them. The freedom to reject all this. And if one were to add something positive that also we should reject, is the freedom to make mistakes. Because being human, we'll have those weaknesses. We'll make mistakes. So that is the freedom also we need. The freedom to make mistakes. But then, having said that, we should reflect upon those mistakes and resolve all sincerity not to make those mistakes. Seek the divine grace for helping us overcome those weaknesses which make us make those mistakes. That is what the journey of yoga is about. It is not going on a guilt trip. It is not about feeling perpetually as if we have sinned and therefore we are beyond redemption. It is the realization that yes, we have made a mistake, acknowledging it, asking for forgiveness, resolving in all sincerity not to repeat it, and also acknowledging that it may be beyond entirely our own efforts, and therefore also enlisting divine grace which would help us overcome that weakness. What I can do is end this session with a sonnet by Sri Aurobindo, which is on the same theme. In my edition of the sonnets, it's on page 43, The Divine Worker. I face earth's happenings with an equal soul. In all are heard thy steps, thy unseen feet. Tread destiny's pathways in my front. Life's whole tremendous theorem is thou complete. I face earth's happenings with an equal soul. Whatever happens on earth, whether it feels pleasant or unpleasant, I face it with an equal soul. I accept it with equal delight. In all are heard thy steps. In everything that happens, I can hear your steps. You are behind everything that is happening. Thy unseen feet tread destiny's pathways in my front. So, behind everything that happens, I can hear your steps. And in front of me, I can see your unseen feet leading me towards my destiny. Life's whole tremendous theorem is thou complete. If life is looked upon as a theorem, which means a brief sort of an expression of something very deep and important and profound, then this is all thou. Thou is. That sort of is the shortest expression of everything that happens, everything that is, because only that is. So that includes my life, and therefore life's whole tremendous theorem is thou complete. No danger can perturb my spirit's calm. My acts are thine, I do thy works and pass. Failure is cradled on thy deathless arm, victory is thy passage mirrored in fortune's glass. No danger can perturb my spirit's calm. Nothing can disturb me, nothing can perturb me, nothing can make me miserable, not even a danger. My acts are thine, I do thy works and pass. What I am doing is your work, you are making me do it. I do thy works and pass. I come and I go, your work continues. I have my privilege to do something and pass. Failure is cradled on thy deathless arm. In some of the things that I do, apparently I fail. But that failure is cradled on thy deathless arm because once I feel that it is being supported by you, it is resting on your deathless arm, failure does not feel like failure anymore. How can it be something negative like failure if it is your support that is behind it, if it is cradled on your deathless arms, something which is immortal. Immortality is the ultimate success. So if it is resting on that immortality, on your deathless arm, failure is not really failure. It's only my limited vision that makes me see it like a failure. So failure really is not failure. And same applies to victory. Victory is thy passage mirrored in fortune's glass. What I see as victory is only an image in a glass. The glass is fortune. So the glass or the mirror called fortune shows me something which I see as victory. And that makes me feel elated. But actually all that has happened is, it is your passage. It is you who is walking, and your walk is interpreted as victory. So it's my interpretation. Now if I am able to look at both what I see as failure and what I see as victory, if I can see in both either your deathless arm or your walk taking the events in a certain direction, then where is the question of being attached to the outcome? In this rude combat with the fate of man, thy smile within my heart makes all my strength. Thy force in me labors at its grandiose plan, indifferent to the time snake's crawling length. In this rude combat with the fate of man, thy smile within my heart makes all my strength. So, fate can be cruel, fate can be rude, but in my struggle with that fate, your smile within my heart, your presence which I can feel and know all the time, makes all my strength. That is my strength. Then nothing affects me, no matter what fate might have in store for me, no matter how fate reveals itself to me. Thy force in me labors at its grandiose plan. So it is thy force that is working through me. It is thy force that is at work within me, and it has a grandiose plan, which means it is not directionless. It has a certain direction for me, it has a certain direction for the universe, indifferent to the time snake's crawling length. So time is a human concept. Time is like a snake, it is crawling. But then I remain indifferent to that passage of time, because the divine has eternity at its disposal. No, as Sri Aurobindo says, time is eternity revealed. So our concept of time is only revealing us eternity bit by bit, in small steps. Indifferent to the time snake's crawling length. So things may happen slowly by my standards, by my mental standards, but that slow progress does not affect me, because I know the journey is endless. And the one who has designed this journey is not in a hurry. It has eternity at its disposal. No power can slay my soul. It lives in thee. So this is the realization that you are immortal, and so am I, because I am you. No power can slay my soul. The I part then dissolves. I am no longer I am you. No power can slay my soul. It lives in thee. Thy presence is my immortality. Om Tatsavitur Varam Rupam Jyotih Parasya Dhimahe Yanna Satyena Deepayet. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti.